We are standing in a forest, but this is not a forest you have ever seen. The trees around us are 30 meters tall and they have no leaves. No branches the way you'd recognize branches. They're more like enormous green columns rising straight up into a sky that looks wrong. Too green. Too thick. The light filtering through has a quality to it that you can't quite name, and the air, if you could breathe it without passing out from oxygen intoxication, would smell like something between a greenhouse and a lightning strike. And then something passes overhead. Something with a wingspan wider than a large eagle, catching the dense air beneath its wings with a sound like a flag snapping in wind. It circles once. Then it's gone. This is not another planet. This is Earth. 300 million years ago, before the first dinosaur ever walked, before the first lizard blinked in morning sun, before anything we would recognize as the modern world existed, something stranger, something more terrifying, something that reshaping everything we thought we knew about life on this planet was already in full, absolute control. Stay with us, because in the next 60 minutes, we are going to go deeper into this world than any classroom ever took you. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is a space documentary channel. What does prehistoric Earth have to do with space? And honestly, everything. Because to understand the universe, we have to first understand the one planet we actually know, including the versions of it that would kill us instantly. The Carboniferous Period is one of those versions. And it is more relevant to the search for life beyond Earth than almost anything else we could show you. That's a promise. Hold on to it. Let's establish where we are in time, because the number we're working with is so large that it requires some handling. The Carboniferous Period spans roughly 359 to 299 million years ago. That's a 60 million year epoch. To put that in terms a human brain can actually process, if Earth's entire history were compressed into a single 24-hour day, humans don't appear until 11:58 and 43 seconds p.m., less than 2 minutes before midnight. The Carboniferous. That's around 9:30 in the evening. We are barely more than halfway through the story when this chapter opens. And it opens in aftermath. Because the world we're entering is not a paradise, it's a rebuilding zone. Just before the Carboniferous began, Earth experienced the late Devonian mass extinction, one of the 5 great dying events in the entire history of life, a catastrophe that eliminated nearly 75% of all species on the planet. The Carboniferous is populated by the survivors of that catastrophe. Everything here is descended from something that refused to die when most things did. That context matters. This world carries the memory of near-total annihilation, and it is building itself back with a kind of relentless, almost aggressive vitality. The geography is unrecognizable. There is no Atlantic Ocean. Europe and North America are fused together into a single landmass called Euramerica, sitting astride the equator like a vast tropical continent. To the south, Gondwana, the supercontinent of the southern hemisphere, is drifting slowly northward. The continents we know are hundreds of millions of years from assembling into their current positions. Shallow tropical seas cover what will one day be Kansas, London, and Beijing. The map of this world requires you to forget everything you learned in geography class. But the single most important fact about the Carboniferous, the fact that everything else in this story depends on, is what's happening in the atmosphere above all of it. Oxygen. There is too much of it. While today's atmosphere contains roughly 21% oxygen, the Carboniferous atmosphere peaks at approximately 35%. That difference, 14 percentage points, sounds modest until you understand what it actually does to the biology of every living thing. And to understand why oxygen got that high, you need to understand what the Carboniferous forests were doing to the air they lived in. These forests were not forests of oak and pine. They were forests of lycopsids, scale trees with bark like reptile skin, growing 30 meters straight up without branching until the very crown. Giant horsetails the height of telephone poles. Seed ferns spreading enormous fronds over swampy ground. These were carbon sequestration machines of planetary scale, pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and flooding the air with oxygen. Photosynthesis had been running on Earth for billions of years, but never at this scale, never with this density, never with this intensity. Here's where it gets strange. The fungi and bacteria that normally decompose dead wood, that break down the structural compound called lignin, had not yet evolved to handle it efficiently. So when a Carboniferous tree fell, it did not rot. It just accumulated. Piled on top of previous fallen trees. For millions of years. Carbon went underground rather than returning to the atmosphere. Oxygen kept climbing. Every major coal deposit on Earth, the Pennsylvania coalfields, the Ruhr Valley in Germany, the Yorkshire coalfields in England, is the direct fossil record of this process. That coal is compressed Carboniferous forest. Tens of millions of years of accumulated, unrotted trees, pressed into energy-dense rock under the weight of subsequent geology. I want to sit with that for just a moment, because it's the kind of fact that changes the texture of ordinary life. Every time someone lights a coal-fired power plant, they are releasing carbon that was sequestered from the Carboniferous atmosphere 300 million years ago. That is not poetic license. That is geology. The Industrial Revolution ran on Carboniferous sunlight. Okay, so we have our stage. A supercharged, oxygen-drenched, fire-scarred world of towering alien forests. The fire matters too, by the way. At 35% oxygen, fires ignite more easily and burn more intensely. Fossilized charcoal called fusane is found throughout Carboniferous rock formations worldwide, evidence of near-constant wildfires burning across entire continents. Lightning doesn't start a single forest fire in this world. It starts continental ones. And the forests regenerate faster than they burn. The cycle accelerates everything. But here's what no one tells you about the Carboniferous. It wasn't just the insects that grew enormous. Something was living in those dark, oxygen-rich forests that makes every horror movie monster look mild. Let's talk about what 35% oxygen actually does to arthropod biology, because this is the mechanism behind everything. Arthropods, the group that includes insects, spiders, scorpions, and millipedes, breathe through a system called tracheae. These are tiny tubes distributed throughout the body that deliver oxygen directly to tissues by passive diffusion, without the active pumping system that vertebrates use. It's a brilliantly simple system, but it has a physical limitation. Diffusion only works efficiently across short distances. In today's 21% oxygen atmosphere, this limits arthropod body size. The largest insects today are modest creatures, walking sticks, large beetles, the occasional enormous moth. The physics simply won't support anything larger. Scale oxygen to 35%, and the diffusion math changes completely. Oxygen molecules are more densely packed in the atmosphere, diffusion delivers enough to support much larger bodies, and the brake that limits arthropod size in the modern world is effectively released. This is not speculation. It is confirmed by isotopic analysis of amber fossils and biomechanical modeling published in peer-reviewed research. Multiple independent arthropod lineages all show the same size increase in the Carboniferous fossil record, simultaneously, across scorpions, cockroaches, myriapods, and flying insects. A 2023 study in Nature confirmed this oxygen size correlation across these lineages. It was a planetary-scale phenomenon, not a single-species anomaly. And the largest product of this planetary-scale experiment was a creature called Arthropleura. Arthropleura was a millipede relative, not a true millipede, but a separate arthropod lineage that reached confirmed lengths of 2.5 meters and estimated weights of 50 kilograms. To visualize, lay 2 adult humans end to end on the floor. That is Arthropleura. It had approximately 32 body segments, each bearing 2 pairs of legs, roughly 64 legs in total, and a heavily armored exoskeleton that made it effectively impervious to the predators of its time. We have never found a complete Arthropleura specimen. What we have are trackways, fossilized footprints pressed into ancient mud in locations including Scotland, France, and New Mexico, and fragments of exoskeleton. These trackways show a creature moving with surprising speed and precision across the forest floor. A 2021 discovery in a Northumberland cliff face revealed a fragment with an estimated body length of 2.7 meters, the largest confirmed specimen in the fossil record, published in the Journal of the Geological Society. For decades, paleontologists assumed Arthropleura was carnivorous. Something that size, that armored, it had to be a predator, right? But gut content analysis and examination of mouthpart morphology suggests it was primarily herbivorous, feeding on ferns, mosses, and decaying plant matter. The apex land creature of the Carboniferous was a plant eater. The implications for how we model this ecosystem are significant. The largest animal on the forest floor was not terrorizing other animals. It was just eating the forest. Slowly. Comprehensively. I have to be honest with you, the first time I saw a reconstruction of Arthropleura moving through a Carboniferous forest, my immediate reaction was not scientific wonder. It was, absolutely not. And I think that reaction is actually useful, because it tells us something real about how alien this world was. Our primate brain, wired to fear large arthropods as a survival mechanism honed over millions of years, would not have lasted one afternoon in the Carboniferous forest floor. For comparison, the largest living land invertebrate today is the coconut crab, with a lifespan of roughly 1 meter and a weight of about 4 kilograms. Arthropleura outmassed it by more than 10 to 1. The largest modern centipede, Scolopendra gigantea, reaches about 30 centimeters. Arthropleura was 9 times longer. These aren't trivial differences, they communicate that the Carboniferous was not just a bit unusual. It was categorically, fundamentally different from any world alive today. Arthropleura disappears from the fossil record approximately 299 million years ago, at the end of the Carboniferous, coinciding precisely with the global drying event and the collapse of tropical rainforests. As oxygen levels fell and the vast swamp forests retreated, the physical engine powering that enormous body simply ran out of fuel. No asteroid needed. No catastrophic impact. Just atmospheric chemistry, shifting slowly over geological time, withdrawing the conditions that made a giant possible. Clean. And somehow more devastating for the slowness of it. But if Arthropleura owned the ground, who owned the sky? The answer is something that looks familiar at first, until you realize it has a wingspan the size of a large hawk. And it was hunting everything it could catch. Meet Meganeura, a dragonfly that sent shockwaves through the scientific community when its fossils were first described, because nobody believed something that large could actually fly. They were wrong. Meganeura moni was first described by French paleontologist Charles Brongniart in 1885, from a fossil found in Commentry, France. The wing impression, preserved in extraordinary detail in fine-grained Carboniferous limestone, showed a wingspan of approximately 68 to 75 centimeters. Brongniart's colleagues were skeptical. Flight mechanics for an insect of that size seemed to defy known physics. The debate continued for decades, well into the 20th century. Modern biomechanical analysis resolved it. Meganeura flight was not just possible under Carboniferous atmospheric conditions, it was efficient. The higher oxygen content and denser atmosphere provided more aerodynamic lift per wing stroke. Models show Meganeura as a fast, maneuverable aerial predator capable of pursuing prey mid-air, not a clumsy giant struggling to stay aloft, but a genuine apex predator working at the top of a food web with no competition from above. Because here's the thing about the Carboniferous sky, there were no birds. No bats. No flying reptiles. None of those lineages existed yet. The sky was arthropod territory, completely and absolutely unchallenged. Other large flying insects of the period include Meganeuropsis permiana, possibly even larger than Meganeura, appearing in the later Permian, and the Paleodictyoptera, a now extinct order of large plant-eating insects with wingspans reaching 55 centimeters. The Carboniferous sky was busy in ways that have no parallel in the world today. Meganeura shared the hunting adaptations of its modern relatives, scaled up enormously, enormous compound eyes providing near 360-degree vision, spiny leg baskets for snatching prey mid-flight, powerful mandibles capable of crushing large insect exoskeletons. Its prey likely included the giant cockroaches that were abundant in Carboniferous forests. Yes, giant cockroaches were a real and significant presence in this ecosystem, as well as early insects and possibly small amphibians near water. Modern dragonflies are among the most effective predators on Earth by success rate. Studies show they catch roughly 95% of their attempted prey, higher than lions, wolves, or sharks. Meganeura, with a size advantage over everything in its environment, likely matched or exceeded that figure. The dragonfly body plan has been hunting for more than 300 million years. It remains, unchanged in its fundamental architecture, one of the most successful predator designs ever tested. Here is the detail that I find impossible to forget: Meganeura was not some evolutionary dead-end experiment. It was the master of its environment for tens of millions of years, longer, in aggregate, than many celebrated dynasties in Earth's history. We don't make movies about it. We don't build museums around it the way we do for Tyrannosaurus or Triceratops. But its tenure at the top of the Carboniferous sky was real, and it was long, and it was absolute. The Carboniferous sky was not empty. It was owned. So we have monsters above and monsters below. But what about the water? Because the Carboniferous seas and freshwater swamps held something that most documentaries completely skip over, and it may be the most important animal of this entire period. Not because of its size. Because of what it became. The Carboniferous is when four-limbed vertebrates, tetrapods, made their final, irreversible commitment to land. And the creatures doing it looked like nothing alive today. They were the turning point in Earth's history that led, eventually, to every breathing thing that walks, crawls, or runs on land, including us. The transition from fish to four-limbed land creatures had begun in the late Devonian, but the consolidation of vertebrate diversity on land happened in the Carboniferous. Early Carboniferous vertebrates include Pedurpes, one of the earliest confirmed land-walking tetrapods, from Scotland, dating to roughly 350 million years ago. And then there is Westelthiana lizzie, nicknamed Lizzie, found in West Lothian, Scotland, which may represent one of the earliest true amniotes, creatures whose eggs could be laid on dry land rather than requiring water. That second detail is the one that matters most, because the amniotic egg is one of the top 5 evolutionary innovations in vertebrate history. Before it, every vertebrate reproduction was tied to water. Fish eggs, amphibian eggs, all require aquatic or semi-aquatic environments. The amniotic egg is a self-contained life support system. A sealed biological package that provides the embryo with nutrition, waste management, and protection without any external water source. After its invention, the entire terrestrial world became colonizable. Every hillside, every inland plateau, every dry upland forest, suddenly accessible to vertebrate life. The Carboniferous is when this invention went from experimental prototype to dominant reproductive strategy. There is also a famous puzzle in the fossil record called Roemer's Gap, named after paleontologist Alfred Roemer. It covers roughly 360 to 345 million years ago, straddling the Devonian Carboniferous boundary, and during this period the tetrapod fossil record goes nearly silent. We have abundant fish fossils on one side, and a diverse tetrapod fauna on the other, with almost nothing in between. For decades, the explanation was unclear. The current best hypothesis involves low oxygen conditions immediately after the Devonian extinction, creating an environmental bottleneck. The atmosphere hadn't yet recovered enough to support large-scale terrestrial colonization. When oxygen rebounded in the early Carboniferous, tetrapod diversity exploded rapidly. The gap was real. The recovery was fast. The amphibians of this period were nothing like today's frogs and salamanders. Archaeops, a 1.5 meter long, heavily built creature, was a top predator of Carboniferous freshwater environments. Crassigyrinus had a large skull, reduced limbs, and may have been a secondarily aquatic ambush predator, convergently evolving back toward a fish-like lifestyle after its ancestors had already moved on to land. The diversity of Carboniferous amphibians filled ecological roles now occupied by crocodiles, large predatory fish, and freshwater ambush hunters simultaneously. These were not transitional awkward half-things. They were fully realized predators, completely adapted to their environments. And then, in the later Carboniferous, something happened quietly that would change everything. The amniote split. Two great lineages diverged from a common ancestor, the sauropsids, which would eventually produce reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds, and the synapsids, which would eventually produce mammals. Us. The earliest synapsids, creatures like Archaeopteryx, were small, lizard-like animals that looked completely unremarkable. Nothing about them suggested that their descendants would one day build cities and point telescopes at distant stars. They were small things scurrying through the undergrowth of an oxygen-rich forest, eating insects, staying out of the way of Arthropleura. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part that actually gets to me. Every person watching this right now is a synapsid. That lineage, starting with a small, unimpressive creature in a Carboniferous forest, never went extinct. It bent. It adapted. It survived the Permian extinction that killed 96% of all species. It survived the asteroid impact that ended the dinosaurs. And it produced us. Whatever we are, and whatever we make of ourselves, we carry that unbroken thread back to this forest, to this moment, to a creature that didn't look like anything special but was, in retrospect, the most consequential small animal that ever lived. But let's not get too comfortable in that ancestral pride, because the Carboniferous world had one more category of giant we haven't visited. And these were in the oceans. The Carboniferous seas were not peaceful. They were hunting grounds. The apex predator of Carboniferous seas was not a fish. It was not a reptile. It was a shark, but calling it a shark is like calling a nuclear submarine a boat. Helicoprion was a cartilaginous fish from the late Carboniferous and Permian with one of the most bizarre anatomical features in vertebrate history, a spiral whorl of teeth, preserved in fossils as a perfect logarithmic spiral sometimes 60 centimeters in diameter. For over a century, paleontologists couldn't agree on where this tooth whorl was located on the animal's body. The tail, the dorsal fin, some strange external structure. A 2013 CT scan of a specimen at the Idaho Museum of Natural History finally settled it. The tooth whorl was in the lower jaw, rotating backward as new teeth grew, the oldest teeth spiraling inward like a biological buzzsaw. It fed primarily on soft-bodied prey, likely cephalopods, relatives of squid and octopus, which were abundant in Carboniferous seas. Alongside Helicoprion, Cladis Lake was a smaller but exceptionally well-documented Carboniferous shark, approximately 1.8 meters long, found in Ohio's Cleveland Shale with stomach contents intact, a paleontological jackpot that almost never happens with cartilaginous fish. Its last meal consisted of smaller fish swallowed whole and tail first, indicating a high-speed pursuit predator that chased prey down rather than ambushing it. Its anatomy, forked tail, streamlined body, is nearly identical to fast modern sharks like the mako. 300 million years of refinement, and the fast shark blueprint barely needed changing. The Eurypterids, sea scorpions, were also present in the Carboniferous, though in decline from their earlier dominance. The largest species had appeared in the Devonian, but Carboniferous Eurypterids were still formidable predators, representing an ancient lineage finally being outcompeted by increasingly sophisticated fish and early sharks. Their eventual extinction by the end of the Permian closed a chapter on a predator design that had ruled aquatic environments for over 200 million years. Meanwhile, Carboniferous North America and Europe were partly submerged under shallow, warm epicontinental seas, extensions of tropical ocean covering vast areas of the continental interiors. These seas were extraordinarily rich: crinoids, brachiopods, bryozoans, corals in abundance so great that their compressed remains form the limestone deposits found today in Indiana, England, and Belgium. The stone of medieval European cathedrals frequently contains Carboniferous fossils visible to the naked eye: crinoid stem segments, brachiopod shells, coral fragments. People have been walking past Carboniferous marine life in church walls for centuries without knowing it. Sharks, for their part, have been swimming in Earth's oceans for over 450 million years. They survived every mass extinction. Every single one, without exception. And in the past century, human activity has pushed dozens of shark species to the brink of extinction. I mention that not as a lecture, I mention it because the juxtaposition is genuinely staggering when you hold it against the geological record. 450 million years of survival. That's the context. We've covered the giants of the Carboniferous above ground, below ground, and in the sea. But there's a dimension to this world that most documentaries miss entirely, and it might be the most consequential story of the entire 60 million year period. It happened underground, in the soil between the roots of those towering forests. And the relationship it established wasn't competition, or predation, or any of the dynamics we've been talking about. It was something stranger. It was cooperation. In the Carboniferous, the mycorrhizal symbiosis between plant roots and soil fungi became the dominant pattern of terrestrial plant life, and understanding it changes how you see every forest that has existed since. Fungal hyphae, microscopic threads thinner than a human hair, penetrate plant roots and extend outward into the surrounding soil in networks that can cover thousands of square meters. Through these networks, the fungus accesses phosphorus, nitrogen, and water from soil volumes that a plant's root system alone could never reach. In exchange, the plant provides the fungus with sugars produced through photosynthesis. This is not parasitism. It is not predation. It is one of the oldest, most successful joint ventures in the history of life, a trade that both parties benefit from, maintained across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The Carboniferous forests were built on this partnership. The towering lycopsids, the giant horsetails, the seed ferns spreading across the coal swamps, all of them operating with fungal networks extending below their roots, amplifying their reach into the soil, feeding them minerals they couldn't access alone. Before the Carboniferous, the Silurian and Devonian world had been dominated on land by prototaxites, enormous fungal structures, up to 8 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter, that towered over the pre-forest landscape. By the Carboniferous, true vascular plants had largely displaced these surface-fruiting giants, but the fungi went underground and became, arguably, more powerful than ever. Invisible. Ubiquitous. Foundational. The key fungal story of the Carboniferous, though, is actually an absence. White rot fungi, the organisms that produce enzymes capable of breaking down lignin, had not yet evolved or spread globally. Without them, dead wood didn't decompose. Carboniferous forests fell and accumulated, building vast peat bogs and coal swamps, locking away carbon at a rate the Earth had never experienced. When white rot fungi eventually evolved and spread near the end of the Carboniferous, coal formation slowed dramatically. Almost all of Earth's major coal deposits are Carboniferous in age precisely because this decomposition gap existed then and only then, a 60 million year window that opened and closed, never to reopen. The soil beneath every forest on Earth today is the product of a process that began, at planetary scale, in the Carboniferous. Before vascular plants, soil was thin, rocky, and largely inert. Carboniferous forests, with their deep root systems and associated fungal infrastructure, built the first thick, nutrient-rich soils, the foundation for everything that grew in every subsequent geological period, including the agricultural soils that feed 8 billion people right now. I want to be transparent about something here, because the fungal network story has gotten somewhat oversimplified in popular media recently. The Wood Wide Web narrative, the idea that trees communicate intentionally through fungal connections, is contested science, and some of the more dramatic claims have outrun the evidence. What is not contested is the underlying mycorrhizal symbiosis. That is real, well-documented, and ancient. The Carboniferous forests had it. It worked. The rest is a conversation the scientific community is still having. So we've built our Carboniferous world from the ground up, literally, from fungal networks in the soil to giant insects in the sky. Now comes the question this entire journey has been building toward. Why did it end? What could possibly bring down a world this robust, this oxygen-rich, this dense with life? The Carboniferous rainforest collapse. A climate event so severe it didn't just kill species, it fragmented the entire world into isolated islands of evolution. And in doing so, it accidentally created the conditions for something the Carboniferous giants could never have imagined. The trigger was already built into the world's own success. For tens of millions of years, Carboniferous forests had been stripping CO2 from the atmosphere at a rate the Earth had never experienced. Carbon went underground as peat and unrotted wood. The atmosphere cooled. At the same time, Gondwana, the vast southern supercontinent, had drifted into polar latitudes, and ice sheets began forming over it. Global climate shifted from the warm, stable, humid conditions that had allowed the great equatorial coal swamps to flourish toward an increasingly seasonal, increasingly dry world. The vast tropical forest belt that stretched across Euramerica began to fragment, not all at once, but in pulses, driven by Milankovitch cycles interacting with the changed atmospheric chemistry. Orbital variations in Earth's path around the Sun, which had always existed, now interacted with a dramatically altered climate system to produce swings between wet and dry that the forests couldn't absorb. The continuous coal swamp paradise broke apart into isolated islands of forest separated by dry corridors that populations of animals couldn't cross. Here is the unexpected twist in this story of collapse: the fragmentation may have been evolution's greatest gift. When populations that had previously interbred are suddenly isolated from each other, they evolve independently. Small changes accumulate without being diluted by gene flow from the larger population. Different isolated populations adapt to slightly different conditions. New species emerge. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse, now understood from detailed stratigraphic analysis, accelerated amniote diversification, the sauropsid and synapsid lineages that would eventually produce every land vertebrate alive today diverged and diversified rapidly during and after this fragmentation event. The destruction of one world was, simultaneously, the engine of the next. As forests shrank and the CO2 to oxygen ratio shifted, atmospheric oxygen began its long decline from the 35% Carboniferous peak. Arthropleura disappeared. Meganeura and its giant relatives went extinct at or near the Carboniferous Permian boundary. The oxygen engine that powered the giants had been throttled. The most dramatic experiment in arthropod gigantism in Earth's 4.5 billion year history was over, and it would never be repeated. The compressed remains of the Carboniferous forests, meanwhile, were beginning their transformation. Under accumulating sediment, organic material was compressed and heated, slowly converted from peat to lignite, then to bituminous coal, finally to anthracite. This process continued long after the Carboniferous ended, but the raw material was Carboniferous. The Industrial Revolution that built the modern world was powered by the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Every steam engine, every early factory, every forge, they ran on the stored chemistry of a forest that died because it was too successful at sequestering its own atmospheric fuel. I'm going to say something and then move on quickly. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse was triggered by a 60 million year process of CO2 drawdown, the opposite direction from what's happening in the atmosphere today. But the underlying mechanism, atmospheric carbon changes altering global climate at planetary scale, is the same physics in both cases. The Carboniferous teaches us, unambiguously, that Earth's climate responds to atmospheric carbon. That's not a political statement. That's stratigraphy. Okay. Moving on. The creatures that survived the collapse were not the giants. They were the small, the adaptable, the generalists, early reptiles, small synapsids, seed plants that handle drought better than spore-based plants. The inheritors of the post-Carboniferous Earth were not the dominant animals of the Carboniferous. They were the survivors of its end. Every large land vertebrate alive today, every mammal, every bird, every reptile, descends from those survivors. And now comes the part where we earn the space documentary label. Because what happened on Earth during the Carboniferous is not just Earth's story. It is a template. And it is one we are beginning to use. Astrobiologists studying the potential for life on exoplanets use Earth's own history as a library of reference points. Different periods of Earth's past represent different atmospheric and biological configurations, different answers to the question of what a living planet can look like. The Carboniferous represents one extreme of that library: high oxygen, high primary productivity, complex terrestrial ecosystems, rapid evolutionary diversification, and near constant fire. If the James Webb Space Telescope, or its successors, like the proposed Habitable Worlds Observatory, were to detect an exoplanet with a 35% oxygen atmosphere via transmission spectroscopy, that would be an extraordinary biosignature. Oxygen at that concentration cannot maintain itself without massive, ongoing photosynthesis. It is a chemical signal that life is not just present but dominant, reshaping the atmosphere at planetary scale. We would flag that planet. We would point every available instrument at it. And if the physics of insect-style respiration, the tracheal diffusion system, is a solution that evolution tends to converge on in oxygen-rich environments, as the evidence suggests, we might also expect that planet to have large arthropods. The logic is clean: oxygen drives diffusion capacity determines maximum arthropod size, therefore oxygen concentration predicts arthropod size. On a Carboniferous exoplanet, you might get Meganeura. you would certainly get something we don't currently have a name for. There's a Fermi paradox angle to the Carboniferous that I find genuinely compelling and underexplored. The Carboniferous oxygen spike was not inevitable. It required two specific evolutionary innovations to coincide: lignin-synthesizing plants evolving before lignin-degrading fungi spread globally. Change the timing of either, give fungi a 10 million year head start on the lignin problem, or delay the evolution of wood-producing plants, and you don't get the oxygen spike. Without the oxygen spike, you don't get giant insects. Without the accelerated evolution driven by the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, you might not get the rapid amniote diversification. Without that diversification, the eventual pathway to mammals becomes much less certain. To humans, effectively impossible. The Carboniferous is a case study in evolutionary contingency, the idea that major outcomes in the history of life depend on small differences in biological timing. The universe might be full of planets with simple life, with multicellular life, with complex ecosystems. But the specific sequence of contingent events that produced tool-using intelligence on Earth required a Carboniferous, and the Carboniferous required a very specific set of coincidences. This speaks directly to why the cosmos might appear empty of signals despite being full of chemistry. The JWST has already demonstrated the ability to detect atmospheric components in exoplanet spectra. A Carboniferous Earth viewed from 10 light-years away would show high oxygen, low CO2, the infrared signature of photosynthetic vegetation, and possibly carbon monoxide from the near-constant surface fires. That is the specific fingerprint we're refining our instruments to detect. When we talk about searching for life beyond Earth, we are partly searching for a Carboniferous analog, a planet so alive that it has lost control of its own atmospheric chemistry. Here's the reframe that lands hardest for me: when we point a telescope at a distant star and detect oxygen in the spectrum of one of its planets, we might be looking at a Carboniferous world. A world of 70-centimeter dragonflies and 2.5-meter millipedes and forests that never rot. A world more alive, in terms of raw biomass and oxygen production, than Earth is today. We would classify it as potentially habitable. Technically accurate. Also the understatement of the millennium. I realize we're now firmly in space documentary territory after spending most of this video on prehistoric bugs. I stand by the journey. The Carboniferous is a space story. It is the story of what happens when you alter one atmospheric variable on a rocky planet in the habitable zone. That experiment ran for 60 million years. We have the geological record. It's in the coal seams under Pennsylvania and the limestone under Indiana and the amber preserved in museum collections around the world. Now, before we close, I want to come back to Earth. To now. Because the Carboniferous left us something. Something we carry in every cell and in every fuel tank and in every breath. Understanding what it left behind changes the way you see the ground beneath your feet. Let's start with the most obvious legacy, and then work down to the most personal. Coal. The most direct and consequential material inheritance from the Carboniferous. Every lump of coal ever burned in human history is compressed Carboniferous forest. Every coal-fired power plant that has ever run, and there have been thousands, across 2 centuries of industrialization, was running on carbon that was sequestered from the Carboniferous atmosphere between 359 and 299 million years ago. The carbon cycle that drives modern climate discussion is, in significant geological part, the reversal of the Carboniferous carbon sequestration event. The Carboniferous buried carbon over 60 million years. Industrial civilization has been unburying it in approximately 200. That ratio, 60 million years in, 200 years out, is the actual geological context for atmospheric carbon chemistry. It is not metaphor. It is the measured record in ice cores, tree rings, and atmospheric monitoring stations. The oxygen we breathe is also a Carboniferous legacy, though a more complex one. The post-Carboniferous oxygen decline settled over geological time toward the roughly 21% we breathe today, a long-term equilibrium between photosynthesis and respiration that has been maintained, with fluctuations, since the Permian. The Carboniferous peak of 35% was a deviation from that equilibrium. We are living in its aftermath, breathing the stabilized atmosphere of a system that has been recovering from the Carboniferous experiment for nearly 300 million years. The marine legacy is written in stone. The shallow Carboniferous seas produced enormous quantities of limestone, calcium carbonate deposited by corals, crinoids, and brachiopods accumulating over millions of years in the warm epicontinental waters. This limestone is quarried today for cement, for the aggregate in concrete, for road construction. The built environment of the modern world is partly constructed from Carboniferous seafloor. The next time you walk past a stone building in Europe, look closely at the cut surface. You will often see crinoid stem segments, small rings of stone that were once the skeletal columns of sea lilies waving in a warm Carboniferous sea. They are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. And then there is the most personal legacy of all. Every mammal alive today, every human being watching this, every whale in the ocean, every bat navigating by echolocation, every elephant with its centuries of memory, is a direct descendant of the Carboniferous synapsids. The genetic continuity from Archaeothyrus, that small unremarkable lizard-like creature scurrying through the coal swamp undergrowth, to Homo sapiens is unbroken. 310 million years of continuous biological inheritance, through every extinction, every catastrophe, every planetary transformation. You are, in the most literal biological sense, a Carboniferous animal's descendant. Not metaphorically. Not approximately. The mitochondria in your cells trace their lineage through an unbroken chain of surviving organisms all the way back to a world where a 2.5-meter millipede was the dominant land animal and the sky was patrolled by dragonflies with 70-centimeter wingspans. The amniotic egg, the innovation that made terrestrial vertebrate dominance possible, that was consolidated as a reproductive strategy in the Carboniferous, is the reason you exist. Without it, no terrestrial reptiles, no dinosaurs, no mammals, no primates, no humans. The Carboniferous is not a footnote in Earth's story. It is a structural load-bearing chapter of the story we are living in right now. When I first went deep into the Carboniferous for this video, I expected to find a world that felt distant and alien, a curiosity, a strange detour before the more familiar dramas of the Mesozoic. What I actually found was something I wasn't prepared for, a world that felt consequential. Directly connected to now. The coal seams, the oxygen baseline, the synapsid lineage in our own DNA, the Carboniferous didn't end at 299 million years ago. It went underground. And it's been running things from down there ever since. That's worth sitting with. We started this journey standing in a forest where something enormous circled overhead. A world that no human eye has ever witnessed, where the ground was patrolled by armored giants and the sky belonged to predators we have no name for in any modern language. A world where the trees didn't rot when they fell and the air itself was thick enough to keep a dragonfly the size of a hawk aloft without effort. We traced the oxygen engine that made the giants possible, walked with Arthropleura across the forest floor, watched Meganeura hunt in a sky it owned completely. We followed the first amniotes as they cracked open a biological invention that would eventually produce every land vertebrate alive. We dove into Carboniferous seas with Helicoprian's spiral jaw and Cladis Lake's perfect predator form. We went underground into the fungal networks building the first real soils, and we watched the entire 60-million-year experiment slowly compress itself into the coal that built the modern world. And then we pointed a telescope at the stars and realized that the Carboniferous isn't just Earth's history, it's one of the most important reference points we have for understanding what life looks like when it runs unchecked on a rocky planet in a habitable zone. The giants of the Carboniferous didn't disappear. They became the coal under your feet, the air in your lungs, the calcium carbonate in the walls of buildings you walk past without looking twice, and the DNA in every cell of every mammal on this planet. They became us. So if you ever find yourself standing near a coal seam, or in a cathedral with old stone walls, or just outside on a clear night looking up at stars that might have planets with 35% oxygen atmospheres and no idea what to do about it, remember you're not just a person standing in the present. You're the latest chapter in a story that started in an oxygen-drunk forest 300 million years ago, written by creatures that had no idea they were writing anything at all. The universe doesn't give us many chances to understand what life looks like at its most extreme, its most inventive, its most alive. The Carboniferous is one of those chances, preserved in rock and coal and the molecule in your cells, waiting to be read. We took that chance today. The next question is what you do with it, and if you find yourself wanting to dig deeper, the Permian comes next, and what happened there makes the Carboniferous look like a warm-up act. The Permian. Now there's a story that makes even the most seasoned paleontologist pause before they describe it. But that's for another time, another 60 minutes, another journey into deep time that will leave you looking at the ground beneath your feet with entirely different eyes. For now, we have covered 300 million years of planetary history today, and if you made it this far, I want you to know that puts you in rare company. Most people stop at the dinosaurs. You went further back. You went to the world before the world anyone talks about, and you found it was stranger, more consequential, and more connected to your present than anyone in any classroom ever told you. The Carboniferous is under your car. It is in the concrete beneath your shoes. It is in the oxygen moving through your bloodstream right now, the adjusted descendant of an atmosphere that once ran so hot with life that the entire planet was essentially one enormous photosynthetic engine with a short-circuit problem. And somewhere in the coiled architecture of your DNA, somewhere deep in the cellular memory you carry without knowing it, there is a sequence that traces directly back to a small synapsid that survived the Carboniferous rainforest collapse and kept moving forward into a world it had no map for. That animal never knew it was going to become you. But here you are. Which, when you think about it, is either the most humbling fact in natural history, or the most extraordinary, and I genuinely cannot decide which. If you want the Permian next, the extinction that killed 96% of all marine species and nearly ended the entire vertebrate experiment, that video is coming. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the moment this channel drops you into that story, you know what to do. Until then, I'll leave you with this: somewhere beneath wherever you are sitting right now, at a depth that varies by geography but is never impossibly far, there is a seam of compressed Carboniferous forest. 300 million years of dragonflies and giant millipedes and fungal revolutions, pressed flat and black and patient, still holding every joule of solar energy that passed through those leaves in a world no human eye will ever see. It has been waiting 300 million years. It waited this long. It can wait for you to go looking. Looking at what has already been written, the script has covered parts 1 through 5, parts 8, 9, and 10, and now needs parts 6 and 7, plus the hook section and the outro with CTA. The ending passage already written flows into the outro territory, so the remaining unwritten sections are part 6 and part 7, which need to be inserted into the body of the script before the existing part 8 content. Since this is a continuation request, the writing picks up to fill those missing sections and closes with the outro and CTA. Now, before we talk about what happened when the Carboniferous started to unravel, we need to go somewhere most documentaries skip entirely. Because everyone focuses on what was walking on the land. The millipedes. The dragonflies. The early amniotes taking their first cautious steps into a future they had no blueprint for. But while all of that was happening on the surface, while Arthropleura was bulldozing through the undergrowth and Meganeura was hunting in air thick with oxygen, something entirely different was happening beneath the waves. And what was living in the Carboniferous Ocean is, if anything, even stranger than what was breathing the air above it. The Carboniferous seas were warm, shallow in many places, particularly over the vast tropical shelves that covered what would eventually become Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. The global configuration of the continents was in active motion. Gondwana was beginning its slow collision with Euramerica, and the Tethys Sea was still wide and warm and full of life that had been building complexity for hundreds of millions of years before a single tree had ever fallen in a Carboniferous forest. These were not young oceans. They were ancient, experienced, and stocked with predators that had been refining their designs since the Devonian. And among those predators, there is one that demands its own moment of silence before we continue. Helicoprion. If you have never encountered Helicoprion before, I want you to picture a shark, because that is roughly what it was, a cartilaginous fish in the broad lineage that produced modern sharks, but with a modification to its lower jaw that looks less like evolution and more like a fever dream. Helicoprion had what paleontologists call a tooth whorl. A spiral of teeth, coiled like a saw blade, growing in a continuous curve from the tip of its lower jaw back into the jaw itself. The outer teeth were the largest. As new teeth grew inward, the older ones were pushed into the interior of the spiral, creating a compressed record of every tooth the animal ever grew, preserved in one continuous coiled structure. For over a century after Helicoprion fossils were first discovered in the 1890s, paleontologists genuinely could not agree on where in the body this structure was located. Some thought it was on the snout, like a natural buzzsaw mounted at the front of the face. Some thought it was a dorsal structure. The reconstruction arguments ran for decades, and I mention this not to embarrass anyone in the field, because the fossil record for cartilaginous fish is genuinely incomplete. Cartilage doesn't preserve the way bone does, but because it illustrates something important about Carboniferous ocean life. These animals were strange enough that even with the fossil in hand, with the physical evidence right there on the table, trained scientists looked at it and disagreed about basic anatomy for 100 years. That is how alien this world was. We are not exaggerating the strangeness for dramatic effect. The evidence itself is dramatic. The current best reconstruction, supported by CT scanning and biomechanical modeling from research published in the 2010s and 2013 specifically, places the tooth whorl entirely within the lower jaw, functioning something like a conveyor belt cutting mechanism. When Helicoprion bit into soft-bodied prey, cephalopods, primarily, the squid-like animals that were abundant in Carboniferous seas, the whorl rotated, drawing prey back and in, slicing as it went. It was not hunting the same prey as a modern great white. It was hunting animals with no hard skeleton, processing them with a mechanism that had no analog in anything alive today. Helicoprion could reach lengths estimated between 3 and 7.5 meters depending on the specimen and the researcher, making it one of the largest predators in Carboniferous oceans, a rolling circular saw moving through warm water in search of cephalopods, belonging to no group of fish that survived into the modern world. But Helicoprion was not alone, and it was not even the most unsettling thing in those seas. Because the Carboniferous ocean also contained sea scorpions, eurypterids, that have been terrifying things in shallow water since the Ordovician. By the Carboniferous, most eurypterid lineages were in decline, the great age of sea scorpion dominance having peaked in the Silurian and Devonian. But decline is relative. A declining eurypterid was still an armored predator with raptorial claws capable of reaching lengths of over 2 meters, still capable of moving between salt and fresh water, still capable of ambushing prey in the shallows where land and sea met. The ones that persisted into the Carboniferous were the survivors of multiple earlier upheavals, animals that had already outlasted mass extinction events and kept adapting. They were not going quietly. And here is what I find most extraordinary about the Carboniferous ocean, the detail that stops me every time I come back to it. it was full of sharks. Not modern sharks, nothing that would look familiar if you dropped it into a contemporary ocean. Carboniferous sharks were experimenters. The late Paleozoic is sometimes called the golden age of shark diversity, and for good reason. While the post-Devonian extinction had pruned many lineages, the Carboniferous saw a radiation of shark body plans that was almost exuberant in its variety. You had Cladis Lake, one of the most elegantly preserved Carboniferous sharks from the Cleveland Shale deposits in Ohio, a streamlined, fast-moving predator that lacked the calcified vertebrae of modern sharks but had a body plan efficient enough that its basic architecture has echoed through 400 million years of ocean predator design. You had Stethocanthus, which had a bizarre flat-top structure on its dorsal fin, the exact function of which is still being argued, that looked less like a fin and more like an antho. Current thinking suggests it may have been a display structure, possibly involved in mating or threat signaling, but the honest answer is that we are not certain. And you had Falcatus, a small shark barely 30 centimeters long where the males had a remarkable curved spine projecting forward from above the head, a spine that, based on fossil evidence of two individuals preserved together, the female was apparently biting during what appears to have been mating behavior. The Carboniferous Ocean was not a simple place. It was strange from the surface to the floor, from the shallows to whatever lurked in the open water beyond the continental shelves. The reason the Carboniferous Ocean matters, beyond the inherent impossibility of its inhabitants, is that it was the stability engine for the whole system. The shallow tropical seas were building limestone at extraordinary rates, locking carbon into reef structures and sediment that would eventually become the carbonate rock in buildings you walk past without looking twice. The ocean was processing carbon, regulating the global carbon cycle, providing a chemical buffer for the wild photosynthetic activity happening on land. The Carboniferous biosphere was not just a terrestrial story. It was a land-sea system running at full capacity, with both halves pushing the limits of what chemistry and biology could sustain simultaneously. And then there is the layer nobody talks about. Not the sky, not the sea, not even the ground surface, but what was happening underneath it. Because the Carboniferous underground revolution is arguably the most consequential story in the entire 60 million year period, and it is the one that almost never gets its own paragraph in popular accounts of prehistoric life. We need to talk about fungi. Specifically, we need to talk about what happened when wood, truly structural wood, the kind that the Carboniferous forest was building in enormous quantities for the first time in Earth's history, met the organisms that were slowly, imperfectly, and over millions of years, learning to break it down. The problem at the beginning of the Carboniferous was straightforward and catastrophic in its implications. Trees had evolved lignin. Lignin is the compound that makes wood rigid, the molecular architecture that allowed trees to stand 30 meters tall instead of sprawling along the ground like earlier plant forms. It is, chemically, a complex polymer of aromatic alcohols, cross-linked in ways that make it almost impervious to breakdown by most biological mechanisms. Modern white-rot fungi can degrade lignin. They have specific enzymes, peroxidases and lactases, that break the aromatic bonds and reduce lignin to something metabolizable. But those enzyme systems took time to evolve. And at the start of the Carboniferous, they did not yet exist in anything like their modern form. This is not a minor detail. This is the mechanism behind the coal. When a Carboniferous tree fell, a lepidodendron 30 meters tall, an Archaeopteris or a Sigillaria crashing into the swamp floor, there was nothing that could fully break it down. The bacteria of the period could process the soft tissues. They could work on the cellulose to a degree. But the lignin was effectively immortal. It accumulated. Layer after layer, century after century, forest falling on top of forest, all of it piling up in the oxygen-depleted anaerobic conditions of tropical swamp basins that perfectly preserved organic material rather than allowing it to oxidize into carbon dioxide. 60 million years of this process produced coal seems tens and sometimes hundreds of meters thick. The extraordinary coal deposits of Pennsylvania, of South Wales, of the Ruhr Valley, of Donbass, the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution, that reshaped the entire trajectory of human civilization, is Carboniferous forest that never rotted. It is what preserved by the absence of the organisms that would eventually evolve to eat it. The Industrial Revolution ran on the corpses of trees that outlived the fungi that were supposed to consume them. That fact alone should stop you mid-sentence every time you think about it. But here is the other side of that story, and this is the part that genuinely reshaping everything we thought we understood about how ecosystems develop. The fungi were not absent. They were evolving. Slowly, incrementally, under enormous selective pressure, because lignin represents an enormous caloric resource, and any organism that could access it gained a massive competitive advantage. The fungal lineages that would eventually produce modern white-rot fungi were developing the enzymatic toolkit to attack it. And as they did, they were simultaneously building something else entirely, the first true soil food webs. Modern forest soil is not just ground-up rock mixed with decaying organic matter. It is a living system, threaded through with fungal mycelium networks, the white thread-like hyphae that connect root to root, tree to tree, transferring nutrients and chemical signals across distances that make individual plant root systems look like local operations. The mycorrhizal networks that modern forests depend on for phosphorus transport, for communication of stress signals, for the transfer of carbon between established trees and seedlings, that entire underground architecture has its origins in the Carboniferous. The fungi that were learning to break down lignin were simultaneously forming the first deep partnerships with plant roots that would eventually become the mycorrhizal systems that underpin virtually every forest ecosystem on Earth today. Prototaxites, worth mentioning here even though it predates the Carboniferous proper, was a fungal or fungal-like organism that reached heights of over 8 meters in the Devonian, a towering fruiting body in a world before trees. By the Carboniferous, fungal forms were diversifying into the soil ecosystem with the same explosive creativity that characterized every other biological lineage in the period. The Carboniferous was not just building giants above ground. It was constructing the invisible infrastructure beneath the surface that would quietly run every subsequent forest ecosystem for the next 300 million years. There is a moment in thinking about this where the scale becomes genuinely difficult to hold in mind. We are talking about organisms with no nervous system, no eyes, no capacity for intention, organisms that are networks of microscopic tubes growing through dead matter, and those organisms are the ones that built the foundational architecture of terrestrial ecology. Not the giant millipedes. Not the dragonflies. Not the early amniotes that would eventually produce every mammal and bird and reptile alive. The fungi. The invisible, underground, unspectacular-looking fungi. I'll be honest with you, when I first started putting this section together, I almost moved past the fungi quickly, the way most documentaries do, because fungi are genuinely difficult to make visually dramatic. You cannot put a CGI Arthropleura next to a mycelial network and expect the network to win the frame. But the more I read, the more I became convinced that cutting the fungi short would be the equivalent of telling the story of the Industrial Revolution and leaving out the steam engine because it doesn't look as good as the factory floor. The fungi are the mechanism. Everything else in the Carboniferous ecosystem is, in a meaningful sense, downstream of what was happening underground. By the time the Carboniferous rainforest collapse began, the fragmentation of the great tropical coal forests into isolated island patches around 307 million years ago, driven by cooling and drying of the climate, the fungal networks have been building soil complexity for tens of millions of years. The collapse of the forest canopy exposed that soil to new conditions. It changed the selection pressures on the organisms living in it. And it accelerated the evolution of the lignin-degrading enzymes that would, by the end of the Carboniferous and into the Permian, bring the era of coal formation largely to a close. When fungi finally learned to eat wood properly, They stopped the burial of carbon that had been the Carboniferous coal swamp's defining characteristic. The coal age ended not with a bang, not with an asteroid, not with a volcanic episode, but with fungi getting better at their job. Which is, depending on your perspective, either deeply anticlimactic or the most extraordinary ending to a 60-million-year story that you could possibly imagine. The Carboniferous doesn't ask you to be impressed by it. It doesn't need your validation. It ran for 60 million years before the first dinosaur existed and left behind the fuel source that powered the entire industrial age of human civilization, the oxygen baseline that your body is calibrated to, the coal seams that are still burning in underground fires in places like Centralia, Pennsylvania, fires that have been going since 1962 and show no sign of stopping. Carboniferous forest still combusting 300 million years after the trees that made it fell into a swamp and waited. And if that isn't the most patient slow burn in planetary history, I don't know what is.